Mic check 1 2. So I want to share something that a lot of video game collectors will not talk about, especially the collectors that have these extremely large collections. And by large, I mean thousands and thousands of games. And this is something that I've talked about on my channel before, but I felt like this might be a better way of illustrating some of what I'm talking about. So there are three categories of video games that I think most people try to either keep out of their collection altogether, or they try to limit how much of this type of stuff they have in their collection to avoid wasted space. And that is going to be the shovelware tier of games, the fluff tier of games, and then to a certain degree, filler games. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start with the shovelware tier. Now, shovelware games are typically games that were really only good or fun to play, I should say, for the time that they were released. Usually, sports games are going to be heavy in this category, right? So, while NBA 2K1 was a ton of fun to play back in 2000 and 2001, it's not going to be the most fun basketball game to play because as a person who watches basketball, I'm going to want to play a basketball game that kind of mirrors what I'm seeing today. So 2K, 24, 2K25 is going to be more of my speed, which kind of then just makes a game like NBA 2K1 a pure nostalgia play, which means that unless you have some type of nostalgic attachment to that sports game, it is going to be absolute shovelware because nothing about the game is going to be relevant to basketball today. And that's a big part of the reason why a lot of sports games fall into the shovelware category. The other types of games that fall into the shovelware category are what I like to think of as like fourth string, right? And any sports team, you have your first string players, your second string players, you've got your third string, and then the guys that ride the bench. And I would say that these are the games that are poor replicas of much better versions of the same type of game. We all know that when it comes to the Wii, the gold standard for like sports games is going to be the Wii Sports games. So Wii Sports Resort. And then obviously you also have like the Mario sports games like Mario Tennis, Mario Golf. Those are going to be the premier sports games. Most people would buy those games first before ever thinking to pick up a copy of Deca Sports 2. Most people probably haven't heard of this game because this is one of the many, this game is pretty much the fourth string of this type of game on the Wii, right? Like there are so many better options to play if you're looking for a sports game on the Wii that this is probably not going to hit your radar. Now, it's not to say that it's not a good game. It's just been produced in such high quantity and it's, there's so many better versions. This is just kind of relegated to a shovelware status. And so a lot of collectors who do have these extremely large collections, they will sometimes have a large number of these types of games in their collection. Also a large number of sports titles in their collection, which, like I said, unless you have some nostalgic attachment to it, like unless when you were 10, the only game you had was Deca Sports and you just have a crazy nostalgic attachment to it, this type of game is going to be a game that no one is really going to care for, right? So then the second tier of games is what I would call the fluff tier, right? Now, these games aren't necessarily as bad as like the shovelware games, but they are a lot of fluff because, they're pretty much regulated to a certain type of audience. When I think about games like the Lego games, these are games that I would typically give my child to play, right? These are, for the most part, kid games. And so really that whole like 10 and under, 11 and under, that's pretty much the audience for this type of game. And it kind of doesn't really go much further beyond that. And because of that, these games aren't high sellers, right? They're not games that a lot of people will want to keep in their collection forever. Again, barring any nostalgia factor, there's really like a limited audience for these. And if I want to play a Batman game or like a Marvel game, there are way better adult versions of these genres or these types of games that will give me a better Marvel experience, right? If I want to have a Batman experience on a video game or a Spider-Man experience, I can think of a lot of other games that are going to give me a better experience than this. However, this would be the age appropriate version for someone who's, you know, small. If you have a small child, you don't want to give them, you know, if you have a child that's like 9 years old, 8 years old, you don't want to give them, you know, Batman Arkham. It might give them nightmares, right? So there's definitely a niche group for these types of games. And then the same thing when it comes to, like, you know, the racing games and more Lego games, right? So there are a lot of really great racing games out there. Gran Turismo, you know, Midnight Club. There's so many classic racing games. Unless you're just a diehard Sonic fan, you're not gonna really be hunting down Sonic All-Stars Racing, just because there's so many other types of racing games that make a play on like iconic characters like the Sonics and the Marios of the world, even like Crash Bandicoot Racing, things like that. There's better versions of this, and so this again just appeals to that niche, you know, game player. And so these are more types of games that are fluff, right? You can definitely have a collection with thousands of these games. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different Lego games and racing games across a number of systems. But again, these are not going to be the games that will probably get you excited. You know, they're not the games that will make that you'll say, all right, man, I can't wait to go home and play Sonic Sega All-Stars Racing. Not to say that there's no one that feels that way, but the audience for this is very small. Now we have this next tier, and I think this is the tier that a lot of people, you know, who try their best to keep a pure collection, a collection free from the shovelware and the fluff. This is where a lot of people probably fill out their game collection, and they fill it out with the filler titles. To me, these are titles that are not bad at all. They were produced in mass quantity, so you're running into these types of titles all the time. They're typically very cheap, $10 and under, and they give a really good experience, right? They give a good experience. When released, they were the premier game for their time, but they never built like a cult following. You know, there are some games that have like this cult-like following where no matter how many years have passed, there's always that group within the gaming community that just like religiously holds certain games in high regard. And we could just, you know, we could name a few. Chrono Trigger is a really old game, but when it comes to RPG lovers, Chrono Trigger will always be somewhat of a gold standard. Legend of Zelda, right? When you think of top-down action RPGs, Legend of Zelda will always be like a gold standard. You know, you think about, you know, fighting games, right? Street Fighter 2, right? That's always going to be somewhat of a gold standard for fighting games. So that's where a lot of these games come into play. And it's usually going to be games like, you know, your Dark Souls, your Star Wars Force Awakens, your Street Fighters, your Ninja Gaidens, right? Games that, Darksiders, these are games that aren't really expensive at all, but they still offer a decent gameplay experience. They're unique in their own right. You can definitely tell that some work and some effort was put into them. They weren't just slapped together. You can tell by the artwork and the design. You could tell by the game layout and the structure. These were well-built games. They just weren't, you know, they just didn't have that type of staying power. And filler games is, I think, the place where a lot of collectors, this is where the buck stops for a lot of collectors. I think most collectors are trying to weed these types of games out of their collection, and they probably want the lowest value games or the lowest tier of games in their collection to be these filler titles. Obviously, you can go a little bit of a step further when you get into games like God of War and Killer is Dead. These are more kind of unique titles, more niche, and that's where you kind of take it a step up. And then from there, you know, the games get a little bit more rare and more expensive. But what a lot of collectors won't tell you is that this is what is making up a lot of their collection, because there aren't that many of these types of games around. There are less quality games and high tier games than there are bad games. And if you don't believe me, just go to GameEye, download the GameEye app, and just pull up any system that you want to look at. And I guarantee you that only about maybe 20 to 25% of the entire library is quality. You'll quickly realize that the bulk of the library is sports titles, shovelware, and just lame games that you won't want to play. But let me know down in the comments what you think. Do you think that this is true? Do you think that this is the case for most collectors, or do you think everyone is just running around with a collection full of grails? Let me know down in the comments. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.